Let's get started. So welcome back to the first of our semester B external guest speakers for the Practice as Research seminars. So those of you who've been following along know that the seminars now, the research seminars for the School of Film and Media and soon to be the School of Film and Journalism and Media, or I'm not sure which order that's going to be, that the research seminars are themed by semester. So this semester we've been exploring and really challenging ourselves to think about practice as research and what we mean by practice as research. It's something that, you know, we've been banging on about for probably close to a decade now, and we still don't really seem to know how to recognize it, how to know when we're doing it, how we know whether we're doing it correctly, and how we can do it better. So this is what I'm seeing as a long conversation between speakers who've never met from across the media industries, to ask, and I've asked each one of them to think about how they tackle research, so, how they embed research into their practice, how they embed practice into their research, what they describe it as. And we had a workshop a few weeks ago, which spent about 35 minutes asking whether it's practice-based research or practice as research. And that I think does matter. So we've got four more talks for the rest of the semester. But today I'm delighted that Dr. Rowan Aust has agreed to join us. I forgot to actually check, Rowan, I've never pronounced your surname before. Is it Aust?
It's Aust, like Australia.
Aust. Austria. That makes much more sense. So Dr. Rowan Aust. Rowan was awarded a PhD in 2019 from Royal Holloway, London, as part of the ADAPT project, which if you look it up, I'll put the links into the chat. It's a really fascinating project. And it's a major ERC, European Research Council funded project, which investigated television production culture through a technological lens. So really, there's some of the same questions that we've been talking about. Prior to joining ADAPT, she'd worked in television production, starting in Sydney on Australia's Ground Force, but once back in the UK, specialising in arts, news and documentaries for the BBC and some indie production companies too. Rowan's research is fascinating, and one of the main reasons I asked her to come and talk to us looks into ethics of care and the felt experience of TV production, with an interest in the equality, diversity and inclusivity agenda, or agendas. She is co-director of a group called SMTJ, Share My Telly Job, and I'm sure in the questions or perhaps in the talk, Rowan will be happy to talk about this. It's a really fascinating scheme. Again, I'll put the URL into the chat because it's a really fascinating website. And Share My Telly Job advocates for parity of working conditions in TV. Publications, I'm not going to list them all, but include an article on TV production and women without children. I don't know how, but an article on the impact of COVID pandemic on mothers working in the UK TV industry. I don't know where you find the time to write that. Care and cultures of TV news producing, reflexive practice, and so on and so on. So I'm delighted today that Rowan is going to talk to us about the embodied research and what does practice-based research mean to you. So I'll cede the floor to you, Rowan.
Thank you very much for that rather flattering introduction. I'm going to start with a confession. I thought I was talking to students today, so my paper is pitched really quite wrongly. So if you would bear with me, I hope it still provokes some questions and good discussion points, but I'm absolutely not talking down to you. I just thought you were different. So if you'll forgive me, I will press on nonetheless. So hello everyone. My name is Rowan Aust. I'm a television producer turned academic. I work at Huddersfield as a lecturer in television studies and production, while I also work with SMTJ. I'm a mother of two, which is an important point for reasons I'll come to later. My research, as Andrew said, is into care practices in film and TV production and is informed both by my academic and industry work, the latter of which includes the work I do now and the experiences of my previous career. So this is a rather personal talk, so please forgive my discomfort at it being so, but it's important as part of a feminist framework that lived experience is validated through the ongoing discussion. There is this historiographical point about oral history that's still being anathema to some empiricists, despite being decades old. For this point, I would direct students normally to Sheila Rowbotham's 1973 Hidden from History, or Tony Parker's In No Man's Land, first published the year before. Reading these accounts of women's lives now has resonance because their palpable surprise at being recorded echoes through the years. I was going to make the point to the students, for particularly the women, to make sure your experiences are received as just as valid as your male counterparts. So I was the first person in my family to go to university. I went to Edinburgh, which, as you'll understand, is the class basis for university, particularly in the 90s, is particularly posh. I felt the gendered class dissonance acutely, although I was branded as being a chippy feminist at the time, when feminism in the 90s was not an identity many opted for. And this was truly my first understanding of how my lived experience could inform my thinking. I would add that then I didn't understand it as such. I simply felt I was out of step. I had no idea how to navigate university, and after graduation did a master's simply because one of my tutors recommended me for it. He opted me into a network I'd been previously unaware of. Thinking about networks and who they primarily benefit is something I still do, and understanding how the punitive exclusionary aspects of networks can be mitigated, while the potential for them to benefit those who would otherwise go unrecognized remains a puzzle to be solved, as you'll all know. What these experiences did, however, was give me a lasting appreciation of class identity and the ways in which it was often obscured and elided from conversations around equality, diversity, and inclusivity, and I refer to that as EDI, for the benefit of those who are, for myriad reasons, wishing to retain the status quo, or sometimes in a way that is even more problematic, retain parts of it. This is certainly something I was going to invite the students to talk about this as young people who are about to enter the industry. So after my master's, I had my running and temping start to my career, which is typical of how many without contacts break into the industry, doing very short-term running jobs of days or a few weeks, mostly on commercials and low-budget shorts and features interspersed with often office-based temping jobs. I did gain a commission of £10,000 to make a short film through the Glasgow-based Cineworks scheme, and went to Mexico City and produced a 6-minute documentary about Mexican bagpipe pipers. The experience was illuminating, even if the film was terrible. I navigated layer upon layer of sexism with a crew-based scorn at my lack of knowledge of audio equipment. And should you ever encounter this, I urge you to emphasize the crew are employed to know about the equipment, all the other staff are not. Or the masculinized world of festivals. The film was shown at Edinburgh, where I was a very young woman with a short film commission and no interest in becoming a member of what I can loosely describe as the Scottish Filmmaking Club. Again, here to note the networks driven by commonalities of gender, accent, or specific knowledge bases which maintain a hierarchy. These hierarchies are unspoken and often dismissed, but evidence of them is residual. For example, in the creative or creative/administrative hierarchy of television, which I'll elaborate on later, but where the residue remains in the pay gap that exists between the ostensibly equally valued and necessary streams of work. So returning to early in my TV career, being a runner on commercials was fraught, with one producer asking me within minutes of my having arrived on set if I would like to both fetch his cigarettes and become part of his porn collection. It is these behaviours, initiated and maintained by gendered workplace hierarchies, which are the punitive experiences of women and repeated across all protective characteristics. I still don't think I would want to be a trans new entrant, for example, trying to build a career today. It is this, however, that the activist care work and that I and others in the film and TV industry are working to eradicate. So I got my first continuing TV contract in Australia, in Sydney, Australia's ground force. This is, of course, where the framing of my lived experience as a recalled ethnography begins, as I became embedded in the production process on a longer-term basis. Channel 7 offered insights into how TV could be run absolutely with parity in terms of hours. This becomes very important later, but nevertheless remained a deeply sexist place, sometimes to the point of misogyny. This was in 2003, a high point of the post-feminist punitive scrutiny of women. And I was going to recommend to the students that they watch any of the Britney Spears documentaries, or the 3-part Channel 4 series on the Spice Girls, or the documentary Amy, to gain an insight into how intense the everyday objectification of young women was then. This has informed my feminism greatly, and I certainly do not endorse either the feminism equates to choice or objectification as empowerment lines. But I was curious as to what the younger generation would say to that. So I returned to the UK after getting married and started at the BBC Arts Department a month later, a job facilitated by a contact in Sydney, again, networks. Since this talk centres on acknowledgement, it's important to understand I benefited throughout my career from my networks. And while I applied for jobs I didn't get, I never applied for a job I did get. I always got work through someone I know. I never fitted the written criteria somehow, although I was never out of work. This in itself was a discomforting experience. Yet for someone like me who relied on my work to get me my next job, but has never been able to work a room, as the saying goes, this points to the way in which a network of experience rather than contacts can be an equitable way of advancing through the industry. It also highlights the fact that diversity schemes, which often concentrate on first jobs alone, need to be extended to account for career gaps and barriers. For example, I didn't have a child until I was 35, but had I fallen pregnant earlier, when I was still new to TV in London, I wonder if I would have been able to get back in. Reflecting upon this experience suggests that the building of experience rather than networks is essential, therefore. So how do EDI programs accommodate this? So back again to the mid-2000s and the fact of my marriage being important when I first arrived at the BBC. This speaks to the additional factor of continually accounting for the personal in the public space, because for women, we remain defined by our personal lives in a way that does not happen to men. My marriage was something which was a notable feature amongst the junior staff and made me less susceptible to the overt sexism and predatory behaviour that is a feature of television work because of my perceived unavailability, which of course is a form of sexism itself. And I refer you to the Instagram account Shit Men in TV Have Said to Me for ways in which such sexism continues. This gave me an understanding of the projection of meaning onto the bodies of women and the intimacy of this, where marital status aligns women to a group in a way that their maternal status does as well, and how these things are connected to age. The intersection of ageism and sexism remains an under-researched area in production studies. So I hope at this point that the ethnographic element of my lived experience are becoming clear. I then shifted from being production... Sorry, my husband's going to get my daughter from boxing. I then shifted from being a production coordinator to a researcher. When I'd worked in Australia, this was mostly on gardening and makeover shows as a production location assistant and coordinator and production manager. So these roles are important for what happened later. And I'd harboured little ambition to shift to editorial, which, as I'm sure you know, is the supposedly creative side of television, although I would add that scheduling and managing the competing forces of production as production managers do is a creative, nuanced and nimble job in itself. So I arrived at the Arts Department with an MA in Film and TV Theory, where my first job was to coordinate a shoot for a 90-minute doc on British silent film, and I realised I knew more about the topic than any of the researchers in the office. So 3 months in, I started as a researcher on a film about the Royal Academy. So this too was illuminating. The project was the director's first hour-long project, and he was ferociously ambitious. He worked an insane schedule to get the film made and not upset the meagre budget. He expected the same dedication from me. You might think this is not unreasonable, but I had an instinctive resistance to the hours he was working, which included sleeping in the office to complete the script. And when I was unsure about the date of a painting when we were on shoot, he was furious to a point where I found myself consoling him that everyone was tired and it was only television. It struck me then, in 2006, that his attitude was odd, although I certainly felt I was in the wrong and perhaps not cut out for working in TV. What was interesting was the level of scrutiny he extended to me while not visibly questioning his own behaviours. He was the one with the power, after all. 15 years later, Marcus Ryder and Lenny Henry wrote in Access All Areas about those at the top of TV needing to share power, and my formative work experience suggests this needs to include junior levels, even when only managing a researcher. Accountability needs to be led from the top, so throughout the ranks it becomes a standard of behaviour. This idea of accountability is really an abridged version of Joan Tronto's summation of care practice that she articulates in her book Moral Boundaries, where she describes 4 phases of care as caring about, taking care of, giving care, and receiving care. So there's resistance to self-scrutiny by this director was in opposition to the management ethos in production management, which was at that point emphasizing 360-degree accountability. So on the one hand, in a male-dominated, editorial, creative side, the intensely maintained hierarchy with little accountability and where the notion of every job could be your last was the employment paradigm, versus the feminized production manager side, where there were attempts to be accountable. This speaks to a point that approaching 2 decades later remains unresolved. How do these gendered strands of television work integrate with the recent emphasis on the EDI agendas? If editorial remains as television work remains as gendered as it is, as well as being, and this is a dramatic word because I want you to consider it as crucial, if editorial remains untouchable because of its perceived creative centrality, how can the industry move to a place of equality? And I argue it cannot. So far, I've described really the first 6 or so years of my career. And from that first documentary, I worked on a variety of long-form arts docs and on the arts review shows, the Edinburgh Show and Newsnight Review. I had a year out from TV in 2008 and worked in a gallery, again facilitated by my networks, as by this time I knew lots of people in the commercial art world, because the hours of television were putting an intolerable stress on the rest of my life. And this was before even I'd had children. I wasn't unhappy, and I want to emphasize that I had some fantastic experiences making television, and much of it was extremely glamorous, exciting, and fun. But I was aware the hours I worked were not sustainable. I wanted to have children, and it took my husband and I 6 years and numerous miscarriages before we had our first child, which the doctors attributed to lifestyle factors. Since I didn't drink much, had given up smoking and drugs, and this meant the hours I was working, mostly 7 days a week, with evenings, screenings and dinners and work events, were the primary focus of causing this health instability. I didn't see my friends and I barely saw my husband, but the jobs kept coming in and I understood well what Georgina Bourne in Uncertain Vision describes as the promise and glitter of television, where the potential for more fun, more glitter, more everything is very real. The transactional nature of television takes its toll, however, and while there is much to enjoy, recent studies from the Film and TV charity, the Looking Glass reports of 2020 and this year, have revealed the mental health crisis of film and TV workers. Well, I'm not a psychoanalyst or an expert in mental health. It's not a huge intellectual leap to suggest that a sole focus in life is not sustainable if one wishes to have a better work-life balance. I also felt grateful to be working in television amongst these acclaimed and shiny souls where people wanted to know me because I might get them on the telly. I would write about this currency, the transactional and self-perpetuating nature of gratitude and how it entrenches the inequalities driven by long hours in a project I completed last year called The Currency of Gratitude. And the hours issue would become the Time Project, which is run with SMTJ. The Time Project is a time tracking app tailored for film and TV workers, which measures hours and rates to understand which group, as delineated by protected characteristics, are most impacted by the long hours culture I have described. That should be which groups, sorry. The first report from it came out in January and showed that the gender payback is gap, and exists through the different stages of a television career, but it is most pronounced in the early stages. So when a woman is in her 20s, these patterns are set. The fact the gap narrows, never closes, as women become more senior suggests that women might achieve a relative parity, but it has to be contextualized with the failure of the industry to retain women after they have children, which we know as the maternal wall. Men, meanwhile, do not leave the industry. There is no equivalent paternal wall. So I left to do my PhD in 2014. I had my second child a year into that and received maternity pay from my stipend, something I would not have received as a freelancer in television. There is, of course, much more to say and many more past experiences that illuminate my present research. The study of care and care practices in a broader global context is having a moment, one might say, catalyzed by Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and the pandemic. I slightly dread the current focus as it suggests this moment will pass, but I try to remain optimistic as ideas of care, whether in TV production or the hierarchy of care, as exemplified by the racist mediation of the current refugee crisis, has moved into mainstream discourse. It remains essential, however, that TV and the creative industry remain scrutinized so practices within them can be shifted to become sites of parity. I mentioned EDI earlier, and I've been critical of the ways in which I see EDI failing. These programs do not fundamentally address issues of parity, what I see as issues of care, because of their incompleteness. They're too temporary. In Toronto's terms, where recognition, action, giving, and receiving are required for care to be complete, and for this paradigm to replace the gendered hierarchies I've described, care needs to be continual. This continuity is what is lacking, whether prevented by the glittery promises of TV work or the hours that work demands. In conclusion, I'm aware I haven't really answered my own question about whether or not I break my own research rules. So I suppose instead I'll cheat and make some more propositions, because understanding the feeling of work, which is the crux of my research and my practice, because as I work, I try to understand the influences, nuances, and fluxes which make me feel certain things. And from this, I try to research how and why other people feel things similar and different. This is not a finite project, so it is bound to end in frustration if one tries to draw any definite conclusions. However, I do stand for certain things. For example, as I think is clear, the notion of lived experience as being central to my scholarship is anathema to some empiricists, but in a world where the recording of women's experience still lags behind that of men's, it remains important to me to retain this direction of thinking. Women simply do not occupy spaces that are recorded, and particularly the work of mothers is subsumed into other protected characteristics. When gendered work is discussed in a framework of change, it is often led by men. And I point you towards a recent campaign for pay parity on production management, led by 2 men. And just last week, an article in Broadcast magazine, which is the TV industry magazine, on the devaluing of production management, written by a man and illustrated with a photo of him. Can anyone imagine the dissonance of a white person talking about how people of colour are marginalised, or an able-bodied person announcing to the world that disabled people suffer from exclusionary practices? With more reference to production work, when I talk about care practices, I'm really talking about the feminisation of production work, as the personal is increasingly accounted for. This is what EDI is, but its limitations are failing to induct structural change. The idea of the personal being accounted for as being something recent is, of course, misleading. And, of course, the personal has always been accounted for because men have been able to work, while their personal lives, the place where their caring responsibilities reside, have been accounted for by women. Really, it's about trying to add value to care work and lessen value from the masculinized culture of long hours and individual successes. In Amy Holdsworth's terms, this process necessitates the braiding of the everyday, the non-glamorous, the care work, the lived experience into the reflection of the academic. In this way, and really sums up what I tried to do, I tried to make the consideration of the personal into something actionable. And that's it.